I still vividly remember that night when strange, dark shadows infiltrated an ordinary hospital, turning everything into a state of unease and horror. Everyone there, from doctors and nurses to patients, could never have imagined that these dark, non-human creatures were hiding among them. This is not a fictional story, but a chilling reality that I witnessed firsthand. While spirits and witches attacked every corner of the hospital, I was faced with a life or death decision. Believe in the light or let the darkness consume me. Would you dare to face what I went through? Do you believe in the presence of supernatural forces, or is it merely the imagination of someone who is overwhelmed by fear? I invite you to share your thoughts under this post. Comment now to receive a powerful message and connect with the story I will tell you. A story that not everyone dares to hear. From the time I was a little girl, I was raised in a Catholic family that instilled in me a deep sense of faith and the belief that there was always more to this world than what met the eye. My parents were devout, always talking about the unseen forces of good and evil, and how the spiritual realm often overlapped with our everyday lives. As I grew older, I began to take these teachings more seriously, but nothing could have prepared me for what I would experience when I was 15. It was during that time that my worldview began to shift in a way I couldn't have anticipated. That year, I had a vision, one that would stay with me forever and change my understanding of both life and death. I still remember that day as though it were yesterday. I found myself inside a hospital, though it wasn't just a physical place. It felt like I had crossed into another world. It was a strange experience, almost like I was there, yet I wasn't. I walked down the long, sterile hallways, the quiet hum of machines and soft footsteps of nurses the only sounds I could hear. But what struck me the most wasn't the hospital's familiar setting. It was the overwhelming sense of despair that hung in the air. I saw patients lying in beds, pale and frail, their bodies weakened by illness. But what shocked me more was the emptiness in their eyes. There was no hope, no fight left in them. The environment was heavy, weighed down by an invisible force. I couldn't understand it at first. Why did it feel so dark even though the hospital was supposed to be a place of healing? It was a question I couldn't shake, and it gnawed at me for days. But as I sat with this vision, trying to make sense of it all, I began to realize something far deeper than the physical suffering I had witnessed. It wasn't just the patients' bodies that were suffering. It was their souls. It became clear to me that illness and death have unseen spiritual consequences. These people weren't just fighting against physical ailments. They were fighting spiritual battles that most of them couldn't even see. The more I thought about it, the more I understood the depth of what I had seen. I could feel it in the air, a presence, a heaviness that I couldn't describe, but I knew it was there. The darkness wasn't just a metaphor for physical suffering. It was real. It was spiritual. And it was something I had to learn to face. I knew that I had to do something about it, but I didn't fully understand what that something was yet. That vision, however, didn't push me away from the world of medicine. It drew me in. I realized that if I was going to make any difference, it wouldn't just be through treating the body. It had to be through helping the soul as well. I knew I had to pursue a career in medicine, but it was more than just a career choice. It became my calling. I didn't want to just heal physical wounds. I wanted to bring hope and light into the darkness I had witnessed. I wanted to be there for the people who felt like they had nothing left to live for, who had lost faith and who were suffering in silence, not just in their bodies, but in their spirits. In the years that followed, I pursued my medical studies with determination. I wanted to learn everything I could about how the body worked, how it broke down, and how it could heal. But no amount of knowledge could prepare me for what would happen next. The second vision, which came a few years later, would reveal to me even more about the hidden darkness within hospitals. This time, I didn't just see patients suffering in isolation. I saw something even more alarming. A spiritual battle playing out right before my eyes. It was as if the very hospital itself had become a battleground, a place where the forces of light and dark collided, where the struggle for life wasn't just physical but spiritual. It wasn't long after my first vision that another one came. This time, it was more vivid, more intense, and it shook me to my core. I was in an operating room, but it wasn't just any operating room. It was one of those moments where everything seemed surreal, almost like I was both a participant and an observer at the same time. I was there as a doctor, standing over a patient on the operating table, focused on the task before me. But then something strange happened. The sterile, bright lights of the room began to flicker, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight, as if something unseen was closing in around me. I turned my head slowly, and what I saw made my heart race with fear. In the corners of the room, just beyond the reach of the light, I could see them. Dark, formless shadows, creeping and shifting, moving in ways that defied logic. They weren't human, and they weren't just a figment of my imagination. I could feel them, sense their presence, like cold fingers brushing against my skin. There was no face, no shape, just an overwhelming sense of darkness that seemed to consume everything it touched. These shadows were like parasites, feeding off the vulnerability of the patients, of their pain, their fear, their suffering. As I watched, the shadows seemed to grow larger and bolder, encroaching upon the patient's fragile form. I was standing there, trying to focus on my work, trying to save this person's life. But I knew in that moment that there was more to healing than just cutting open the body and stitching it back together. I felt helpless. No matter how many procedures I performed, no matter how skilled my hands became, I couldn't escape the truth that was dawning on me. Medicine alone wasn't enough. It couldn't heal what was truly broken. I could save lives. I could mend bones, remove tumors, and stabilize patients, but I couldn't heal their souls. The darkness in the room was a powerful reminder of that. Medicine could only go so far. It could repair the body, but the spirit? That was something else entirely. In that moment, I realized that even with all the advances in medical science, we were fighting a much greater battle. One that no scalpel, no machine, no drug could address. I knew then that there was more to healing than I had ever understood. The shadows, the darkness, they weren't just physical manifestations of illness. They were symbols of the spiritual battles being waged in that very room. For a while, I couldn't even put the vision into words. How could I explain that what I had seen wasn't just about physical illness, but about something deeper? How could I convey that the operating room was a battleground, not just between life and death, but between light and darkness? But as I grew older, and as I continued to practice medicine, I came to understand that this vision was just the beginning of something much greater. Years later, I had another vision, one that was more recent, but just as profound. It didn't happen in a hospital or operating room, but in a place I could only describe as a battlefield. In this vision, I saw hospitals in a way I had never imagined before. They weren't just places for healing. They were battlegrounds, the front lines of a spiritual war. The walls, once white and sterile, now seemed like ancient fortresses, standing between two forces of light and forces of darkness. As I moved through this vision, I could feel the weight of it all. The tension in the air, as if the very hospital was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The force of darkness was palpable, an unseen presence lurking in the corners of every room, in the hallways, beneath the surface of every conversation, every diagnosis, every treatment. The dark forces in this vision weren't just symbolic. They were real. I saw them for what they were. Hungry, relentless, and always present. These dark forces weren't just after the bodies of the sick and dying. They were after their souls. They were waiting for moments of weakness, waiting for patients to surrender, to lose hope, to give in to fear or despair. And when they did, that's when the darkness would strike. It was in those moments of vulnerability that the souls of the weak or the hopeless were most at risk. The dark forces would creep in, using every ounce of pain and fear to take what wasn't theirs to claim. The feeling of hopelessness that so many patients experienced, it wasn't just a mental or emotional state. It was a spiritual opening, a crack through which these forces could enter. And once they did, it was almost impossible to get them out. This realization lingered in my mind, and soon after, I encountered something that would confirm my growing understanding. An experience that took place during one fateful night shift. I'll never forget that night shift. It started like any other, with the usual quiet hum of machines and the soft shuffle of nurses' feet across the linoleum floor. The hospital, though empty in many ways, always seemed alive at night. Alive in a strange, unnerving way. The air was thick, heavy, like it was holding its breath, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't until I entered room 305 that I truly understood what was happening. I'd been working long hours, the fatigue weighing on me, but it wasn't just physical exhaustion that I was battling. There was something else in the air, something unexplainable that I couldn't ignore. I stepped into the patient's room, a quiet woman who had been struggling with a terminal illness for weeks. Her breathing was shallow and she was heavily sedated, but there was an odd stillness about her. A stillness that felt off, like the room itself had stopped moving. It was then that I felt it. A pressure in the air, almost suffocating. My heart raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced around, trying to make sense of it. And that's when I saw it. A dark figure, standing by the foot of the bed. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or perhaps my tired mind playing tricks on me. But no, this figure was real. Its form solid but formless, a shadow that seemed to suck the light from the room. It didn't have a face, but I could feel its presence. Cold, malevolent, and all-consuming. My breath caught in my throat and I froze, unable to move, unable to even think straight. There, in that moment, I realized something that changed my entire perspective. Whatever I was seeing wasn't just a physical manifestation. This was something beyond the physical. It was spiritual. I had been trained to deal with the medical realities of illness, diagnoses, treatments, surgeries. But this was a force I wasn't prepared for. The figure didn't seem to care about the patient in the bed. It wasn't interested in her physical suffering. It was as if it was feeding off something else. The despair, the hopelessness, the silent fear that had taken root in that room. It was a reminder of something I'd always known but never fully understood. Not all battles are fought in the realm of the body. Some are fought on a much deeper level. While I was faced with a terrifying spiritual presence in room 305, another equally terrifying event took place in room 212, where I once again faced a battle that was not just physical. It was the middle of a particularly grueling night shift when I encountered something that shook me to my very core. The hospital was eerily quiet, with the usual hum of machines and the occasional beeping of heart monitors serving as the only sounds that filled the otherwise still corridors. The night shift is often a time when the world feels suspended between two realities: the living and the dying, the conscious and the unconscious, the known and the unknown. I had seen my fair share of patients in critical condition, but nothing could have prepared me for what was about to unfold. It started in room 212, where a young girl, no more than 12 or 13, lay in a bed, her small body struggling to breathe. The steady beep of the monitor told me everything I needed to know. She was in critical condition, and the prognosis wasn't good. Her parents, who were beside themselves with worry, had stepped out for a moment to speak with the doctors, leaving me alone with the girl. She was unconscious, or so it appeared. But as I stood at the foot of her bed checking her vitals, I noticed something unusual. Something I couldn't quite place. The girl's body was trembling slightly, as though she was fighting against something invisible. Her fingers twitched and her chest heaved in rhythm with her breathing. But there was something else. A subtle tension in the air, an energy I could feel but not explain. It was like she was struggling against an unseen force, something that was holding her in a way no physical ailment ever could. I stood there, watching her, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of it. The monitor showed no change in her physical condition, but the sense of unease in the room was palpable, growing stronger with every passing second. At first, I chalked it up to the stress of the job. After all, I had been working long hours, and sometimes my mind would play tricks on me. But the more I observed, the more I realized this wasn't just fatigue or an overactive imagination. There was something in that room. Something dark. something that I couldn't see but could certainly feel. I had been in hospitals long enough to know that illness could drain a person's strength, but what I was witnessing felt different. The girl's struggle seemed to transcend the physical. She wasn't just fighting her disease. She was fighting something else entirely. As the minutes dragged on, I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that something was terribly wrong. The tension in the room grew thick, almost suffocating. The weight of it pressed on my chest, and for the first time in my medical career, I felt a deep, unsettling fear. A fear not rooted in the patient's condition, but in something far more inexplicable. The feeling was so strong that I could almost taste it, like the air itself had turned heavy with the presence of something sinister. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stand there and do nothing. Without thinking, I silently began to pray. I hadn't meant to, but the words slipped out, born of instinct more than intention. In that moment, it felt like the only thing I could do. As I prayed silently, my thoughts focusing on peace, healing, and protection, I noticed something. I could feel the darkness in the room begin to waver. It wasn't an immediate change, but the heavy weight that had been pressing down on me began to lift. The air seemed to clear, the tension dissipating, as though the very presence of the dark force had been pushed back. I didn't stop praying, and as I did, I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. I looked at the girl again, and for the first time, I noticed her face relax, her body no longer trembling. It was as if the invisible force that had been holding her in such a tight grip had loosened, giving her some respite. The monitors in the room remained unchanged, but the energy had shifted. It wasn't physical. This was something far deeper, something spiritual. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something had happened in that room. The darkness had retreated. The girl's struggle, though far from over, had become quieter, more manageable. The prayer had done something I couldn't fully comprehend, but something powerful nonetheless. Just as I was about to leave the room, feeling a sense of relief, I was stopped by a voice behind me. I turned to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway. She was small, with graying hair pulled tightly back into a bun, and she wore a soft, knowing smile that seemed both comforting and unsettling all at once. She didn't look like a doctor or nurse. She wasn't wearing scrubs or any kind of uniform. Instead, she looked like she belonged there in a way that felt almost otherworldly. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel a strange pull, as though she was seeing straight through me. "I've been waiting for you," she said softly, her voice surprisingly strong for a woman of her age. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply asked, "Who are you?" She smiled again, and there was something about her that immediately put me at ease, even though I had no idea who she was or what she was doing there. "I'm her grandmother," she said, motioning toward the girl in the bed. "I've been watching over her." As she spoke, I couldn't shake the sense that there was something more to this woman than met the eye. I had heard no mention of a grandmother in the family's medical history, nor had I seen anyone else in the room besides the parents. Yet here she was, standing in the doorway as though she belonged. She looked at the girl with such a deep, unwavering love that it was almost tangible. "You've helped her," the grandmother said, her gaze fixed on me. "Your prayer, it has brought peace." I was taken aback. How did she know? Had she felt it too? She must have seen the confusion in my expression because she continued. "The struggle you witnessed, it's not just physical. There's a battle happening here, a battle for her soul. And you've done more than just ease her body. You've given her something greater: hope, protection, light." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I had spent my entire career focused on the physical, on treatments, procedures, diagnoses. But I knew in that moment that this wasn't just a battle of medicine. It was a spiritual battle. I had seen the darkness. I had felt it press down on us. But now, in the presence of this grandmother, I realized something else entirely. I wasn't the only one who had recognized the struggle. She knew too. And she wasn't just talking about physical illness. She was talking about something far deeper, something far more significant. The grandmother didn't need to explain more. I knew exactly what she meant. The hospital in that moment wasn't just a place of sickness and healing. It was a battleground for the soul. As I looked at the grandmother and the young girl, I understood. The darkness I had felt in that room wasn't something that could be chased away with just medicine. It was something that had to be fought with faith, with prayer, with the light that comes from a deeper understanding of the world. In the grandmother's eyes, I saw a wisdom that transcended the physical world. She had been there, witnessing the struggle, and she had known that the fight for her granddaughter's life was more than just a fight for her body. It was a fight for her soul. As I quietly left the room, my thoughts were racing. That night, I understood something that would stay with me forever. The real battles, the ones that truly matter, aren't always fought in the operating rooms or the sterile hallways of hospitals. Sometimes they're fought in the silence of the soul, in the unseen moments that we can't always explain. And sometimes the greatest healing comes not from a scalpel or a pill, but from the quiet power of prayer and the unwavering belief that light can push back the darkness. Through strange and inexplicable experiences throughout my medical career, I began to realize that there were things beyond what science could explain, and another night at the hospital took me on a journey I never thought I would encounter. A journey where the lines between faith and medicine gradually became blurred. I've seen things in my years as a medical professional that I can't quite explain, things that go far beyond what science can account for. There are moments in the hospital when the physical world blurs with something more, something darker, something that you can feel in your bones, even if you can't see it with your eyes. It was one of these moments that started me on a journey I never thought I'd find myself on, one where the boundaries between faith and medicine began to dissolve. It was another late night shift when I found myself in the ICU, walking the long hallways with a clipboard in hand, trying to catch up on paperwork and monitor the condition of a few critical patients. I was used to the rhythm of the night shift by now. The quiet, the flickering lights, the constant beeping of machines, and the faint sound of footsteps from the other nurses. But that night, there was something different about room 314. It felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened, making it hard to breathe. I remember standing outside the door for a moment, feeling the weight of something that I couldn't quite name, but instinctively knew wasn't right. I didn't know it at the time, but I was about to witness something that would completely shake my understanding of what I believed about life, illness, and the invisible forces that shape us. Inside the room was a man in his late 40s, in critical condition. His heart was failing, his lungs barely functioning, and his body was shutting down in a way that even the best treatments couldn't reverse. He had been brought in hours earlier, and the doctors had done everything they could to stabilize him, but the prognosis wasn't good. The family was gathered at his side, their faces drawn with worry and exhaustion. But it wasn't them who caught my attention first. It was the nurse. She was standing by the patient's bed, her hands moving in ways I hadn't seen before. At first, I thought she was adjusting his IV or preparing to check on his vitals, but then I noticed something more, something that felt off. She was speaking softly, muttering words under her breath, and her hands were making strange gestures in the air above the patient's head. It wasn't like any medical procedure I had ever seen. There was no calm, clinical precision. There was something ritualistic about it, something spiritual. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to do. I had seen nurses do their best to comfort patients and families, and I knew some of them had their own personal beliefs that shaped how they worked. But this was different. It wasn't just a calming touch or a soft word of encouragement. This was a full-blown ritual, and the patient, completely unconscious and sedated, seemed to be at the center of it. As I watched, the atmosphere in the room grew even heavier. The lights above flickered as though they were struggling to stay on, and the temperature in the room dropped, a chill settling over everything. The nurse continued her chanting, and I could see the shadows in the corners of the room grow deeper, as though they were reaching out, creeping closer to the bed. I felt it too. A pressure in the air that made it hard to breathe, like a suffocating force that was tightening around the room. I had worked in hospitals long enough to know that critical cases could be draining, but this felt different. This felt like something far beyond the usual battle between life and death. This felt like a battle for something more, something spiritual. I stepped into the room, my mind racing, unsure of what to make of what I was seeing. The nurse didn't acknowledge me. She seemed completely absorbed in whatever it was she was doing. But just as I was about to ask what was going on, the door swung open behind me and a man entered the room. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, wearing simple clothes and a humble demeanor. There was an undeniable aura about him, something peaceful, something grounded. It wasn't his clothes or his appearance, but the way he moved, the way he stood there in the doorway as though he knew exactly what was happening. I could sense that he wasn't just another family member, and I didn't recognize him from the hospital staff. There was something about him that immediately drew my attention. Without saying a word, he walked over to the patient's bedside. The nurse, still chanting, didn't notice him at first, but the man didn't falter. He simply stood there for a moment, looking down at the patient with a quiet, solemn expression. And then, slowly, he placed his hands on the patient's head and began to pray. His voice was steady and calm, a whisper in the midst of the eerie quiet of the room. He didn't chant, and he didn't make any strange gestures like the nurse had. He simply prayed. I felt it then, the shift in the room. The air, which had been thick with that oppressive weight, began to lift. The shadows in the corners of the room started to recede, like they were being drawn back into some unseen space, and the temperature in the room began to return to normal. The flickering lights steadied. There was a peacefulness that seemed to fill the space, and I felt for the first time since entering the room that I could breathe freely again. It was as if the very atmosphere had been cleansed. The spiritual oppression that had been so palpable, slowly lifting, piece by piece, with every word of his prayer. The nurse, who had been so focused on her ritual, stopped suddenly. She turned toward the man at the bedside, her eyes wide with disbelief. There was no anger, no frustration, but a quiet recognition. She didn't say anything, but I could see that she understood. Whatever force she had been summoning was now gone, replaced by something else entirely. A peace, a stillness that felt divine. I watched, transfixed, as the man continued his prayer, his voice unwavering. As he spoke, I could see the patient's condition begin to stabilize. His heart rate, which had been erratic just moments before, began to smooth out. His breathing, once shallow and labored, grew steadier. The pale color in his face began to improve, and the signs of distress seemed to fade. It wasn't an immediate transformation, but there was a noticeable shift in the man's condition. It was as though his spirit had received the healing it needed. The nurse, still standing at the foot of the bed, seemed to step back, her eyes fixed on the patient. She had no words to say, but I could see the acknowledgement in her expression. A deep understanding that the spiritual realm had a far greater influence over the patient's fate than she had realized. The ritual she had performed was not enough. It had not been the answer. It was the prayer, the belief in something greater that had truly made a difference. As the man finished his prayer, he took a step back and nodded toward the family who had gathered quietly at the door, witnessing the entire exchange. There was a look of relief on their faces, as though they had been waiting for something, the answer to their prayers. The nurse, who had been performing her ritual with such intensity, finally spoke, her voice low and respectful. "Thank you," she said, as though she had been given something valuable, something profound. I stood there, in the background, feeling like an outsider in a world I didn't fully understand. I had been trained to look at the body, to analyze the symptoms, to treat the illness. But this was something different, something beyond the body. It was a spiritual healing, one that transcended medicine, one that spoke to something deeper inside of us all. I had watched as the oppressive darkness lifted, as the power of prayer broke through, and as the patient's condition improved before my very eyes. It was then that I understood something I had never fully grasped before. There are forces at work in this world that we can't see, forces that we can't always explain with our medical knowledge or our understanding of science. But that doesn't make them any less real. That night, I witnessed firsthand the incredible power of faith, the power of prayer, and the truth that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from our hands, but from the divine. And that, above all, changed me in ways I can't fully put into words. It opened my eyes to a reality far greater than anything I had ever encountered before. I've learned over the years that what we feel, think, and speak carries more weight than we often realize. We live in a world where emotions and words can shape the reality around us, sometimes in ways we don't fully understand. I've seen it firsthand. The impact of negative energy, whether it's fear, anger, or despair. When we let these emotions take over, they create openings, cracks in our spiritual armor. It's like leaving the door wide open, inviting forces we can't see, but that can have a profound effect on our lives. I'm not talking about something mystical or fanciful. I'm speaking from experience. I've witnessed how negativity can drain a person's energy, how it can draw them away from the light and leave them vulnerable to darker forces. When we're suffering, whether physically, emotionally, or mentally, it's so easy to fall into despair, to let our thoughts spiral out of control. I know this from my own moments of struggle, when the weight of illness, grief, or uncertainty feels overwhelming. But it's in those very moments that we must be vigilant. We must guard our hearts and minds. What we think, what we say, can either draw us closer to light or push us further into darkness. I've seen people, in the midst of their suffering, say things that only deepen their pain. Words of hopelessness, of doubt, of anger at God or the world. And in doing so, they unknowingly invited more of that darkness into their lives. That's why prayer is so vital, especially in times of suffering. Prayer is not just a request for healing. It's a shield, a source of strength, and a way to realign our spirits with truth. It helps us discern what's happening in our hearts and minds, to distinguish between the lies that the darkness tries to feed us and the truth that comes from light. I've seen prayer lift people, transform situations, and even bring healing when everything else seemed impossible. It's in those quiet moments of prayer, when we open ourselves up to divine guidance, that we invite peace into the chaos and strength into the weakness. So, I urge you, be mindful of what you feel, what you say, and how you react to life's struggles. Negative energy can open the door to forces that are beyond our understanding, and it can keep us trapped in a cycle of pain and despair. But prayer, discernment, and a conscious effort to guard our hearts can shield us, guide us, and ultimately help us find the strength to overcome whatever darkness we may face. I believe that each of us can overcome the challenges and darkness in life if we open our hearts to receive the light and strength from God. Although life is difficult and full of challenges, when we stand firm in our faith, pray, and hold on to hope, we will receive the peace and blessings that God gives. Do not let fear or negativity take over your mind and heart, but let prayer be a source of strength, bringing you closer to good things. If you find this message meaningful, please share it with those around you so that everyone can be enlightened in faith. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe to the channel to receive more messages of hope and blessings from God. God is always with you, and I believe that He will give you the strength to overcome all difficulties. Always stand firm in faith and let His light shine in your life.